Today is July 10th, 2018, and we're getting started on a motor for a friend of mine, and it is a 5.3, came out of a Cadillac Escalade. It is going to be a drive-by-wire, which this motor originally was. So this is how I pretty much had it sitting in my shop for probably a year or two. I've been using it for parts here and there, intake, things like that. So this is a good motor to start with. It is mounted on the engine test stand, which I'll probably do some more on later, which has a 1-gallon fuel tank, a battery, and a little electrical panel with oil pressure gauge. So all I've really done this morning was mount it, pull the starter out of the parts bin, threw that in, and then what I was just finishing up here was just used a vacuum cleaner and a razor blade to clean up the surfaces for the intake manifold, and then wiped them down real quick with brake clean. So I plan on taking you through the steps that I take over the next couple days on how I test these things out before I even start them. So if you noticed, I haven't even really cleaned it, because now I know this motor ran over 2 years ago. I drove the vehicle up and down the street before I parted it out. But what I want to do is go through the procedure I do on every single engine, and I would do this whether I was straight from the junkyard or one that I driven myself. So the first thing I'm going to do is check the oil pressure, check the compression on each cylinder, and doing that I know if it's a good motor or not before I put any time in it, before I put any money in it, before I even clean it. So what I'll do is I'll hook up an oil pressure gauge, I check to make sure it's got decent oil in it, and I'll roll it over with a starter. So that's going to do two things. Now I've done 6 or 7 engine starts this way, where I actually use the starter, and if you notice there's no plugs in it, so there's no real resistance on the motor. I'll use the starter, of course that's attached to the oil pump, so we'll be pumping oil through, so that'll pre-lube the engine. And it takes about 10 or 15 seconds sometimes on these, so I'll just bump them over lightly and then slowly start rolling them over. Make sure it's got good oil pressure, so I hook a electric gauge up, drill this out. This one happens to have it. Drill this out, tap it, put my electronic oil pressure gauge there. Start with number 1, do all of the compression all the way through the motor, make sure everything's good. If everything's good, then I'll do the next step, which is taping it up and cleaning it and getting it ready for the next steps. So I will take you through that process of going from a junkyard motor, which we started earlier with the wiring harness, all the way through starting it and doing some heat cycles to make sure everything's good. So this would be, I don't know, series 2 for the motor itself. Got my Summit order in for Richard's 5.3. So these are a lot of the gaskets and stuff and the pieces that I just replaced since it's out. It's easier to do it now and it's cheaper to do it now than later on. So we have the throttle body gasket, torque converter bolts. This is just I need to hook up an oil pressure gauge to the motor. Gaskets for the exhaust manifold, brand new header bolts. Valve cover gasket set, spark plug wires with a 45-degree, oh, there you can see them now. Taylor makes a set of spark plug wires with a 45-degree bend on them, plus they're a little bit longer, so those work nice. Intake manifold set, Corvette balancer, new ARP bolt, really like these. This is the neck for the water pump with a 185-degree thermostat in it. Then we have a new water pump in the box and new water pump gaskets. So once we get this thing tested here next couple hours, we'll start cleaning it up and putting the stuff on. So the first thing I do on these is pull this, it's kind of like a cover is how they use it, because on the 6 liters and I guess with towing packages or something, they have an oil cooler, engine oil cooler. So drill this out for a 1/4 inch NPT tap, which on my tap said 7/16 of an inch. And then you have an adapter, and then I'm using an electrical oil pressure sensor from Autometer, because that's the gauge that I actually have hooked up to my test stand. Make sure you put your thread sealant on this and hook it to the engine. So there we all are assembled. Got the thread sealer in both sets of threads for the 1/4 inch NPT and the 1/8 inch NPT. And then I've cleaned off the mating surface in case you're not sure of where this is on the engine, but it's right above the oil filter. Clean the surface up, and right now I'm just reusing the gasket because, again, I don't have any knowledge of this engine, and I'm gonna, well, I do, but I treat it like I don't know anything about this engine, and I'll put a new gasket on it when it can prove that it runs good. And there's finished installation. So you can either use this to put the sensor, which I like it because it hides it and it keeps it away from the exhaust and everything, but I've never had any problems with them with the header heat. I've actually run mine on my 4-door for about 4 years now and have not had any problems with the sensor down here. But if you're concerned, you can also run where the factory location is. There's a couple people make fittings, I think it's an M16 or something, to NPT tap, and then of course you put a couple adapters in there to put your sensor up here. It's just big and I don't like it back there, so both places work. This is just after the sensor down there, so after it comes in through that, it goes up through the oil lines, and then this is the next position, and that's what feeds the lifters and the cam and crankshaft and everything else. Kind of go over my electrical system here for just rolling the motor over. So of course I have my battery mounted in the bottom on a little movable battery tray, and my negative I just always have them laying around, so I just copped one for the stand off an old vehicle, and I have that connected to a little stud or a nut that I welded into the frame itself. Have all my grounds going off from that. So I hooked up my oil pressure sensor, and that runs back to the gauge. And then I have a hot wire, I know it's blue, but it's correct, and a ground wire. And then for the positive side, again, I just reused the box that comes with your truck or Escalade or whatever you happen to be using. And I tied in the main power up to the electrical panel, just use spade connectors to make it easy to unhook. And then I have a wire running to the starter solenoid, up and back to the starter switch, and then main power comes from this wire up through. So on this ignition panel, all I have to do is turn the ignition on, and then I have it hooked up to wipers, but that's what it had been used for. So you can see the oil pressure gauge works, and start button. So what I'm going to do now is just continue to bump the starter for a couple seconds at a time, and in that way I can get some oil flowing up to the top end of the motor, and then I'll just continue just 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off until I see the oil pressure gauge start to come up, and I usually get about 12.5 psi when I'm rolling over with the starter. Helps if you turn it on. Usually takes about 30-45 seconds till we get it to come up, but I've done this on 4 or 5 engines, or motors, excuse me, engines, yeah, get the terminology correct, and haven't had any problems. You can see we got oil pressure now, so that means all is good. So now I'll run it for 5 or 10 seconds at a time and just get some oil flowing around the motor, and then I'll start hooking up the compression gauge, start checking each cylinder and see what my compression is. This is a compression tester I use. It's a OTC 5605. Got it from O'Reilly Auto Parts. They have a loaner part program, which a lot of the big chains do anymore, and I'm real happy with it. So we'll hook it up and start testing compression. So this particular engine, which I think all of them do, we'll take the M14 metric thread 14 end for your compression testing. So hopefully you can read that. We're hooked into cylinder number 1, which is driver's side front on the LS engine, and I checked it the first time, it was about 150, released the pressure and checked it a second time, and I'm at 170, so I think that's good to start with. Yeah, looks like we can see this. I went through and did all 8 cylinders, so just kind of as your first frame of reference, I call them the odds, so 1, 3, 5, 7. Those are the driver's side of the engine, with number 1 being the front of the engine. And 2, 4, 6, and 8, of course, are the passenger side of the engine, with 2 being the front cylinder on the front of the engine by the fan, water pump, whatever you want to call it. So we'll use that over and over again just to kind of get everybody used to the nomenclature. But the lowest compression we had was 170. And the highest we had on was number 8, which was 190. So I think this is well within acceptable limits. So now I can put the time and the energy into cleaning the engine, which I'll do next, and then I'll start putting the gaskets on, and we'll show you that as we go. It's been about an hour and a half with some paper towels, good paper towels, and just some cheap engine degreaser you get at the dollar store, which I found works pretty well. And went through, started at the top of the engine and started cleaning my way down. And as you can see, I haven't done the valve covers yet, because what I do is I take those off. Of course, I'll probably do that here in a little bit to change gaskets, and it's a lot easier to do that off the engine. I can hit them with degreaser really good inside and out. Use water, use air to clean all the water out, and I'll actually let them set a day or two off the engine before I put them back on. So I don't really spend any time on them there. But I've gone through the back, cleaned everything up, so it'll make it a nice clean engine. And I used to do them outside with water and everything else, and it's just a big hassle, and the shop I currently have doesn't allow me to really move the engines outside because the concrete drips way off and these get kind of heavy. So I just decided to do them in here and use a vacuum cleaner to get the little pieces up. As you can tell, I pulled up the wiring harness for the NOx sensors, and one thing to remember is replace your NOx sensors. They're about 50 bucks a piece, but do them now. It's the easiest time to do them. And there's a piece of foam on the back of the intake right here. Remove that off your intake, because what happens is it creates a dam, so the water builds up on that foam, and as you can see, you start rusting down in there, and that's what takes out your NOx sensors. So front one doesn't look too bad, but it takes 5 minutes to change them now. Otherwise you got to take everything off in order to do it. So just do them now, saves you a little bit of time.